The 1919 New Zealand general election was held on the 16th and 17th of December 1919 to elect a total of 80 MPs to the 20th session of the New Zealand Parliament. It had been 5 long years since the last election, the longest parliamentary session in New Zealand history. This was due to a little event known as the Great War. Well, it wasn't really a little event, especially when you remember it was the most destructive war in history at the time, with almost 20 million dead as a result of the conflict. The New Zealand public enthusiastically supported the war, and there was no shortage of volunteers, with long lines outside recruiting stations during the early stages of the war in 1914. New Zealand troops would first see action when they were sent to German Samoa to capture the German-held islands. The New Zealand Expeditionary Force was sent to Egypt, then organised with the Australian Imperial Force to form the Australian-New Zealand Army Corps, or ANZACs. In April 1915, the ANZACs were then sent along with the British Mediterranean Expeditionary Force to the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey as part of the campaign to invade the Ottoman Empire, which had allied with the Germans. The plan was to capture the peninsula so Royal Navy ships could sail up the Dardanelles unopposed and capture the Ottoman capital of Constantinople. However, the campaign was an absolute disaster and the British forces suffered huge casualties, leading to withdrawal in early 1916. However, New Zealand and Australian troops fought side by side, and this helped forge unique cultural identities for both countries and created a strong bond between the two. On April 25th, the date the Anzacs landed at Gallipoli, both New Zealanders and Australians paused to reflect and remember the fallen. Following the Gallipoli withdrawal, the NZEF was split, with some troops being sent to the Middle East and the bulk being sent to France. New Zealand troops took part in many major battles: the Somme, Passchendaele, Beersheba, and Lequinois. By all accounts, the Kiwi troops were formidable soldiers who left their mark on the battlefield. By war's end in 1918, almost 130,000 New Zealanders had served. However, the war didn't come without great cost. Over 16,000 New Zealand servicemen had been killed and 41,000 were wounded, a 58% casualty rate. Approximately a further 1,000 men died within 5 years of the war's end as a result of injuries sustained. This figure does not take into account the many nurses that were killed or the effects of shell shock and trauma on those returning home. The Great War traumatized the small nation, with 16,000 dead out of a population of barely over 1 million. These deaths shook New Zealand to its core and had a lasting effect on both society and the economy. Nearly 1 out of every 3 men between the ages of 20 and 40 was killed or wounded. World War I showed New Zealand's emergence as a nation, proving itself to Britain, the Empire and the rest of the world, and showcased New Zealand soldiers as men who were fit, loyal, soldier mates who symbolised the Kiwi spirit of egalitarianism, fairness and duty. During the war years, the country was led by Prime Minister William Massey. Despite winning the 1914 election, Massey and his Reform Party had a slender majority and wanted to have a unified government and country. So, reluctantly, in August 1915, a year after the declaration of war, the two major political parties, Reform and Liberal, came together to form a coalition government, with Reform leader Massey as Prime Minister and Liberal leader Joseph Ward as Minister for Finance and Deputy Prime Minister. Bill and Joe were subsequently a duo who travelled overseas together, visiting troops and conferences during and immediately after the war. Despite being labelled as the Siamese twins by the public, there was a great personal enmity between Massey and Ward. Ward saw his defeat in 1911 as something more than a political matter. He believed that the Irish Protestant Massey had played the sectarian card against Ward's Catholicism. In 1916, following the failed Gallipoli campaign and the bloody stalemate on the Western Front, volunteers for the service dropped significantly, and the army wasn't getting the recruits they needed. As a result, the government brought in a policy of conscription. The Military Service Act empowered the government to call up any man aged between 20 and 45 for military service at home or abroad. Conscription was a major factor in the establishment of the Labour Party in 1916. After the 1914 election, the two Social Democratic Party members had cooperated with the 4 other Labour members, but the desire for a united voice against conscription encouraged a formal arrangement. So in June 1916, the Labour Party was officially formed. Labour argued that conscription was the very militarism against which the war was allegedly being fought, and conscription would be unnecessary if soldiers were decently paid. Labour were not the only ones opposed to conscription, however. Many Māori, particularly from the Waikato, resisted conscription and refused to fight in the war, as they would not fight to preserve a government which had oppressed and taken their lands from them. That being said, some 2,000 Māori fought bravely in the war, many of whom wanted to prove themselves and their loyalty to both their people and the Crown. To an increasing degree, and perhaps inevitably, the government was managed by ministerial decree rather than parliamentary resolution. The long-term consequence of the coalition was that the Liberals were increasingly implicated in the unpopular dimensions of wartime government, while getting little credit from reform voters. Labour, however, capitalised on a good deal of working-class dissatisfaction at the Liberals. When the war ended in November 1918, there was cause for much jubilation. However, there was a new crisis at hand, as New Zealand, like the rest of the world, now had to grapple with the Spanish flu pandemic. The pandemic struck between October and December 1918. In 2 short months, New Zealand lost about half as many people to influenza as it had to the whole of the First World War. No other event has killed so many New Zealanders in such a short time. By the time it eased in December, about 9,000 New Zealanders had died. Māori suffered heavily, with about 2,500 deaths, but death did not occur evenly amongst Māori or Europeans. Some communities were decimated, while others escaped largely unscathed. In the aftermath, the public sought answers from the government. What they got was a major reorganisation of the health system in the form of the 1920 Health Act. To the election now. After postponing the election that was due to occur in 1917, Prime Minister Massey hoped to delay a new election until sometime in 1920, when the Versailles Treaty negotiations were over. However, Liberal leader Joe Ward sensed Massey was not confident of victory and, distracted by Versailles, saw an opportunity to catch Massey off guard. Shortly after he and Massey returned home from the Versailles negotiations in August 1919, Ward led the Liberals out of the coalition without warning Massey, destabilising the government and triggering an election. Perhaps well aware of the need to reinforce his party's progressive credentials, Ward issued a radical manifesto, hoping to blunt Labour's advance. Massey campaigned on reforms record in government, warned against the perils of the Red Socialist menace, and reminded voters of the tumultuous final years of Liberal government, which he ended. Massey also took credit for the country's growth in export industries, which boomed during the war. The Labour Party, led by Harry Holland, campaigning for a socialist vision of New Zealand. And the winner was William Massey and Reform, with 45 seats, a gain of 6 since Parliament's dissolution. In a triumphant victory for Reform, who now held a comfortable majority in the House, as well as 35.7% of the popular vote. As much as it was a great night for Reform, it was an absolutely terrible result for the Liberals, who lost an incredible 15 seats to hold only 19 seats in an 80-seat House of Representatives. The swing against the Liberals was so big that Liberal leader Joe Ward lost his seat of Awaroa, which left the party both reeling and leaderless. The Liberals won 28% of the vote and were almost beaten in the popular vote by Labour, who won 24% and a solid 8 seats. Labour increased its vote, particularly in working class electorate that had been held by the Liberals. Although Labour captured only 8 seats, it received nearly a quarter of the votes, a shock to Conservative minds due to Labour being founded only 3 years earlier, in 1916. However, New Zealand voters had overwhelmingly given their support for Conservative governments, and it gave Massey much joy to know there would be 2 parties of the left fighting over the same small amount of voters. One interesting electoral development of note for this election was the role women played. Despite winning the right to vote in 1893, women were unable to stand for Parliament until 1919, when the law was changed late that year, and with only 3 weeks' notice, 3 women stood for Parliament. However, none were successful at being elected.